Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar entitled The Branded Leader. This webinar is part of a special series of educational webinars to help you prepare for tomorrow. Please visit our website at teamlewis.com for recordings of previous webinars and to sign up for future sessions. My name is Sarah and I will be the moderator for today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items regarding today's presentation. This is a live presentation through Zoom, so you may experience a slight delay as we click between slides. Our presentation will last approximately 30 minutes with some time for questions at the end. We'll have a recording of today's webinar available in a few days, and we'll send everyone an email with a link to the recording. All attendees will be automatically muted during today's event to cut down on any background noise, but we do welcome your questions. Please submit your questions via the Q&A button found at the top of your screen, and we will address as many as we can, time permitting. We will end the presentation today with a question and answer session. Also, you can follow the conversation on Twitter by using hashtag IAT and by following us at Team Lewis Global. A little bit about Lewis and who we are. We're a global integrated communications agency, and we are the largest employee-owned agency in our sector. We provide full PR, marketing, and digital services with 30 offices across the globe. You can find out more by visiting us at teamlewis.com. Now, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. First up, we have Miles Daniels. He is a former journalist and an expert corporate storyteller with more than 20 years of media and communications experience. Miles has worked with numerous consumer and B2B brands, crafting narratives and stories that resonate with media. As VP of Media Strategy at Lewis, Miles also oversees the agency's executive profiling practice, where he develops platforms and campaigns to raise the visibility and influence of senior level executives. And next, we have Chris Lewis. Chris is the founder and CEO of Lewis. With a background in corporate finance and content, Chris has worked with a variety of international business and consumer media. He's the author of the best-selling book on creativity, Too Fast to Think, and the co-founder of the Lewis Advisory Board with presidential advisor, author, and economist, Dr. Pippa Malmgren. Okay, with that, I will pass the presentation over to Miles.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Lewis, who, as Sarah mentioned, is founder and CEO at Lewis. Today's topic is one that Chris believes strongly in, and one which is particularly timely given the fact Lewis has just announced a new product built around the idea of branded leadership. It was announced this morning, and Lewis X Pro is a new service offering that helps senior executives elevate their personal brands and profiles. You can learn more about the offering on our website or by sending an email to the address on your screen. Chris, before we dive into our conversation about branded leadership, could you share more with our listeners about Lewis X Pro, why we're launching, and your vision for this new product?
Of course, Miles, I'd just like to say thank you to Sarah and to Shazia and to Annalisa for all of the help in setting up this session. I know there's a lot of work that goes into making these happen, so thank you all very much. In answer to your question, the world that we live in has changed quite dramatically in terms of the access and visibility of leaders in our communities, whether they be business or organizational. The access has changed dramatically, so has the visibility, and that requires a different stance in messaging and a different approach in terms of understanding the needs and the requirements of the community from its leaders.
So let's move from that to talking about what we mean by the branded leader, branded leadership. How does one create a personal leadership brand? What credentials are required? I know we often talk about internally the 5 traits of branded leadership, and the first one that comes to mind is your thoughts on being something versus doing something.
It's a good place to start, because if we look at what a brand is, it's really a representation of a set of values. And it's very difficult to do values. You have to be values. And so consequently, a lot of executive competence is derived from how well an executive or leader does things. And every executive has a to-do list, but it's our contention that a to-be list is also very useful to make sure that the values that they're representing are adhered to.
So maybe some examples, Chris. What would a to-be list versus a to-do list look like if you were to put two columns on a piece of paper?
Well, first and foremost, leaders have to understand the values of the community and their constituents that they're seeking to serve. And that requires a lot more listening than it does talking. And so the four most powerful words that a leader can have are really quite simple. What do you think? What do you think are the most powerful set of words that any leader can use to establish the values of the community that they're seeking to serve?
So we covered, to be versus to do. What do you think? That important question that we have to ask as leaders to all of our constituencies, reflecting the community that we serve. Another one that I like, Chris, that we talk about a lot here at Lewis is connecting emotionally, that emotional connection as a leader.
The leaders we have today, not only are they more visible, but they also, the net result of the visibility is more accountancy and more transparency. And therefore, if they are seen to be involved in something or doing something which is not consistent with those values that the organization or their brand has, then people will point out that there's a deficit in the brand or an inconsistency or an incongruity. And one of the hardest things for leadership to do is to balance the requirement of the ephemeral pressures of the business with the enduring nature of what a brand is. This balance between the short term and long term is creating one of the greatest pressures there is for leadership in our communities.
Interesting. So thought leadership, it's a buzzword that's still widely used today, but the term still has a lot of relevance when talking about branded leadership. How do you define thought leadership, Chris?
This is a phrase that's used a lot in the communications business, but thought leadership, if it's going to be real leadership, has to work at the parenthesis of the conversation. So in order to do that, it needs to have originality. Now, a leader has to accept also that they're only as good as their followers. And one of the key litmus tests for that is to look at leadership on Twitter, for instance, and to assess and gauge the number of followers with the number of people followed. If there is an enormous deficit in that area, the leader is open to the accusation that they're actually not listening to the people that they represent.
Interesting you mentioned Twitter, because certainly in today's world of influencers, there's no shortage of industry experts who self-identify as thought leaders. Is it true that in today's connected world, anyone can be a branded leader or thought leader?
I think the opportunity is open to them, but leadership is essentially about following people. This means hearing their voices, respecting their values, and reflecting their views. Anybody can do that, but we're all familiar with leaders that approach every problem with an open mouth.
Mm-hmm. One of the things as a communications agency that we do a lot of is media training for executives. We certainly, I think, do a good job of helping executives be better spokespeople, the face of their company, talk about the direction the company's heading, the product, the technology. But I think there is a difference between being a company spokesperson and a thought leader. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the difference between the two.
Well, when you look at the values of any community, they seldom focus upon purely the economic. And so when we're talking about a thought leader, we start to stray into the realms of what makes a successful culture in general, whether it's in business or not. So good leadership really focuses on finding potential. And this is most often qualitative, not quantitative. Profits in a community are a byproduct of a successful culture. It's never vice versa.
Then, as we just talked about, of course, this morning, we're launching X Pro, and a program that's really built around executive visibility and executive profiling, which has become such an integral part of most modern public relations and communications programs today. How does a successful program built around an individual leader or bench of leaders benefit an organization?
Well, in a number of ways. Because the leader is now so visible, it can amplify and support a campaign. And often in an organization, it's not enough just to require other people to carry the banner of values. The leader has to be seen to be amplifying and evangelizing those things at the same time. I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing so much more broader messaging coming out of the leadership of a large number of companies, particularly in America, who are actually representing the fears and the values of the communities that they serve. And by this, I don't mean they're mere employees. Every company is a collection of families that depend upon the organization, and they also have a legitimate voice and a legitimate concern within an organization and need to be heard and represented. And sometimes there's a deficit in how that's represented at the political level. And the most immediate place for that to be represented is in the workplace, doing what the majority of people spend most of their time doing, which is actually engaged in a collective enterprise.
So what would you say is the difference between what we would call corporate comms, corporate PR, and personal PR, as we're talking about it in today's conversation?
Well, I think this speaks to also the short-term tenure, perhaps, that some leaders have. Increasingly, we're seeing a shortening of tenure at the leadership level. And so sometimes a leader's brand may endure beyond their tenure within that organization. And so it's reasonable to expect that the organization itself may have different long-term goals than the individual has. And sometimes we see this, that a leader is brought in with a different set of obvious extant brand values in order to change or to create the perception of change within an organization that has different brand values.
That's an interesting question. So, are there risks associated with building a brand around an individual executive? I mean, I think about, Steve Jobs and his association with Apple, and many would say that Steve Jobs defined Apple, was Apple. Is there a risk associated with building a brand around an individual executive?
There is. Branded leadership is a sword with two edges, without a doubt.
Interesting. The next thing I'd love to talk to you about, Chris, is the challenges of leadership in the modern world. And one of the things that you write about in your best-selling book, Too Fast to Think, is this notion of situational fluency. You spent a lot of time thinking and writing about this. Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by being situationally fluent and how this should apply to today's executive?
One of the questions we asked in the book, and we asked this question of military leaders, clergy, artists, politicians, business leaders. We asked them where they are and what they're doing when they get their very best ideas, those sorts of epiphanies that change the way you see the world. And there was a striking similarity in the research that these leaders said that they were most often not at work, they were most often on their own, and very interestingly, they were most often not trying. And so one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is the very model of the Western reductionist education that we're receiving, which teaches us to analyze things, is that sacrificing some of this ability to join the dots by looking across, is, or put simply, is drill down, sacrificing our ability to look across. I mean, the jargon is, how far can we go with analysis before we have to use parenthesis? Ultimately, the leader's job is to join up the dots to see the bigger picture, and that's not always quantitative. It's quite frequently qualitative.
That's an interesting point, because it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, thought leadership versus being a spokesperson. In order to be a thought leader, you really do have to put a stake in the ground. You have to be a visionary. You have to be able to see above the horizon, around the corner, what's next for your customers, for your employees, for your key stakeholders. And it's really challenging to do that if you're constantly drilled down and not giving yourself the time you need to take a look back and see what's on the horizon. I mean, but how do you do that in today's modern world? We're so busy. We're always plugged in. It's a challenge, isn't it?
It is a challenge, and the challenge is to recognize that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And so in the boardroom, there is a tendency to particularly in economically straitened times, to focus on the short term, to focus on numbers. And this focus on the ephemeral can be very expensive when you're trying to build an enduring brand, because there are too many long-term brands which have been sacrificed on the altar of the ephemeral. The Wall Street often requires companies to report every 90 days on their financial performance. What that says about trust, what that says about long-term thinking, you may have a view about, but ultimately the leader's job in a modern organization is to be a custodian of those values and not just the short-term economic success of the organization.
I like that. So what would you say, Chris, are the new priorities of leadership in the modern world? We talked about being versus doing. But again, gone are the days where C-level leadership is confined to the corner office. It's an imperative for leaders to be transparent, front and center, the face of the organization. So what should leaders today be focused on, both internally and externally, to be successful?
They should have fun. And by having fun, they give permission for other people to have fun. Now, this is something that we take quite seriously within the company. Paradoxically, the only thing that we think we should take really seriously is that people have a sense of humor, because a sense of humor means that you have the same terms of reference. It means you have the same outlook, the same judgment, the same timing, that you can relax people, that you might be fun to work with, because ultimately when you're trying to reach potential, leadership is about being able to reach potential. All competence follows preference. People get good at what they like doing. I've worked with many people over the years, and you cannot make them good at something they do not enjoy. And one of the primary variables in whether somebody enjoys their job is whether they enjoy the culture or the people that they work with. And the leader's job is to set that tone. And if one of the brand values in your organization is that people are able to share a common sense of humor, then that goes a long way towards allowing other brand values to come forward. If you're interested in reaching potential, I don't know how you can do that without granting permission for people to do that.
One of the things we talk about a lot when it comes to thought leadership is the importance of having something unique to say, finding your unique voice. And again, as I said, putting that stake in the ground. You talk about three narratives, the three great narratives, and how to find your unique voice in each. How do leaders do that based on your experience?
We touched on one before, which is that you can't recognize emotional deficit in any community without listening. Whatever talents leaders have in terms of their communications abilities, they don't normally involve clairvoyance. And so there isn't any secret to this. One has to go out and ask people what they think, and to be able to use one's judgment to go and find out. And this is one of the key elements in trying to recognize where the brand should go in the future, because a lot of the leadership narrative is around the future. It's no accident that politicians come out with campaigns saying, yes, we can, or it's morning again in America, or make America great again, because they're shifting the narrative towards the future. And right at the kernel of that is what drives each and every one of us every day, which is the notion of hope, that we go forward holding a lantern out over a darkened path into the future with hope. And perhaps that's the primary responsibility of a branded leader, to provide hope that somehow tomorrow might be better.
Mm-hmm. So how does that personal narrative outside of the emotion of, as you just conveyed, in terms of connecting emotionally and the idea of hope, but how does a personal narrative, especially when we're talking about, say, a CEO of a modern organization, differ from a company's corporate narrative, and how important is it that one align with the other?
Well, it's very important, because the CEO in a business or in a public sector organization, leader of any community, needs to reflect the values of the constituencies and the constituents that they serve. So if you think of the orchestra model, the person that's at the front of the orchestra can seldom play any of the instruments better than any one of the individual participants. The role of that leader is to inspire and motivate and to get the best out of the ensemble that they're in front of. And so they may actually not have core competencies and skills which are in excess of the individual participants. In actual fact, they may represent a set of values of fairness or justice or inspiration that actually allow those people permission or grant them permission to perform at a higher level. And I think that's one of the issues that often leadership doesn't see initially, which is that it gets to where it is via the core competencies. It maintains and defends that position on adhering to a set of skills. You get to the top by doing something, and you stay at the top and continue to represent it by being something. And that's where the understanding of the brand is so important to the tenure and to the focus of the modern leader of any constituency, given the range of channels now that they have to contend with.
Yeah, and then there's something you say along the lines of, if you can't find potential in your people, you'll never be able to find potential in your brand.
I think that's essential, because people are, when they're looking at a long-term career, that's nothing more than being able to reach their potential. They have to be able to learn, and a lot of that is not giving anybody any more analytical Western reductionist education. Lord knows a lot of people come into the organization with those credentials already established, and so it becomes much more of a task to be able to unlearn some of that and to start talking in the boardroom about community values such as faith, belief in what you're trying to do, the community that you serve around you, a focus upon them. And everybody knows on an individual basis, most people's problems are caused by the fact they think about themselves too much. If a business spends most of its time focused upon other people's problems, then by its very nature, it often has less of its own.
We talk a lot in today's world about cutting through the noise. There's so much noise to cut through. Social media channels, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. Which ones do you choose for your platform? How do you know which channels to choose in order to not only get heard, but to make a real impact as a leader today?
So some of this is science, some of it's art. We know that there are certain social channels which will reach certain groups much more effectively. When the leaders are constructing messages, it's not just important to have the content that fits, but also the channel strategy, which reaches all the different people, the constituents that they are trying to work with. And that means making sure that the message is accessible enough. And there are certain things that boardrooms don't feel comfortable talking about. They're not often comfortable talking about the love that they have for what they do, or the passion that they have for the brand. They're not necessarily comfortable in talking about their own personal stories. And one of the phenomena that came out of Too Fast to Think was that when you ask leaders to describe themselves, they often talk in terms of what they do. They chair a meeting, they run this particular unit, they manage this particular P&L. When you ask those people in those leadership groups to describe their leaders, they describe them in words that can only go with a verb to be. They say, my boss is a pain in the ass. They say restless. They might say the boss is inspirational, but they always describe them with verbs that can go with the verb to be. And so there's this deficit between what people think they're actually standing for and what other people recognize that they stand for. And that's in essence why XPro is an important launch for us, because it's seeking to join the dots. It's just not enough to give a senior executive a technique for how to communicate. It's actually an intellectual process which recognizes the inbuilt fragility of the Western reductionist model that says we can understand and communicate with the whole world by drilling down, researching, and looking backwards through the rearview mirror, rather than using our imagination and our ability to parenthesize, to look forwards.
But there is the challenge of the fact that today's executive has so many different audiences to consider, both internally and externally. So how does one tailor that message for each of those audiences while maintaining the same values and overarching message, Chris?
So if we take the channels for granted, and that's a big if, then we have to look at universal values. That leadership should use universal values, not selfish, narrow values, not selfish KPIs or metrics, because every leader has their own KPIs or metrics for their own particular unit. But that's why it's useful to ask people in that community, does my personal metric mean a damn to you? Because when you ask individuals, does it matter to you whether this organization makes 15% profit or 20% profit? To them, it probably doesn't. To the shareholders, it probably does. But then the leader's job is to make sure this balance between the ephemeral and the enduring is sustainable. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is it's not only important for leaders to grant permission to their communities to reach their potential, it's also important for shareholders to grant to leaders the ability to reach their potential. And that means to think longer term, to think more broadly about the community, because unless that happens, the very process that they're involved in is under threat. The capital process itself may come under threat because people just don't see the benefit to the community from the process.
Chris, we have just a couple more minutes here before we open it up to audience questions, but I do want to go back to the book you recently wrote, Too Fast to Think, because you talk a lot in that book about left brain versus right brain, the importance of creativity. Can we talk about the importance of creativity in the context of branded leader and branded leadership?
Sure. The creative process is an interesting one because often people focus on it a little bit too narrowly. They focus on the point of explosion, the point of epiphany. And yet so many of the leaders that I interviewed described the process of incubation and induction as being by far the biggest part of the creative process. I think even Einstein said the creativity is defined as the residue of time wasted. It was one of his famous statements. And this is one of the things that Einstein was getting at, which is that if we accept that these epiphanies come to us sometimes quite randomly, but often when we stop doing things, you then reach the conclusion that when you're doing nothing, you're actually doing something quite important. You're allowing your subconscious brain to connect and join the dots and therefore provide an insight and a visibility and perhaps even a vision which was previously invisible. And if we're talking about a leadership vision, then that can be defined as the art of being able to describe the invisible.
So we talked today about, the fact that being a thought leader requires vision, big ideas that no one's talking about, or at least not in the same way that you are. And as you say in the book, generating ideas requires solitude, removing ourselves from the noise. How does today's executive who's running a multinational organization, or even, the sales force of a startup, even begin to find the time needed to be creative, to waste time, as Albert Einstein said?
Well, it's a balance, of course, but these days it's almost become an admission of failure for somebody to admit not being busy. And if you have a leadership representative that is always busy and very visibly busy, then you have to ask the question, how do people access that leadership? Because if you're trying to make a point in a conversation, quite frequently you'll wait for a gap in the conversation. You'll wait for a moment when the person is available to talk to them. If your leader is never available because they're always so damned busy, then it makes it impossible to hear what somebody's got to say to you. And after all, the flow of the values and the information is so very important that your leaders often are in a situation where they criticize the people that bring them bad news. And my contention is that they should actually welcome that. I think every leader recognizes that it is difficult to welcome such news when they're tired and overworked. And everybody that we interviewed for the book described themselves as being at least twice as busy as they were 5 years ago, and even probably more busy than they were 5 years before that. And so we have to ask the question, not only are they more busy, that's obviously yes, they feel more busy, but are they more productive? And with the overload of information that they face from the multitude of channels, they simply become overloaded very quickly with interruptions, which is potentially one of the biggest problems they have.
Chris, Thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure. I know we have some audience questions, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for you to answer those, so I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Miles, and thank you, Chris. We'll take some time for questions now. Just a reminder, if you haven't done so already, please be sure to submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the top of your screen. Looks like we do have some questions that have come in, so let's get started. Chris, a viewer asks, who is a leader that you think exemplifies true brand leadership?
I think that's changing. Some of the fresher faces that we're seeing leading corporations like Anne Sweeney from Disney and Ginny Rometty from IBM are very encouraging in that they represent fresh thinking in those organizations. It's difficult to get away from people who have been building brands in the long term. Somebody like Richard Branson is indivisibly associated with the Virgin brand, and indeed there's a great example of somebody living the brand, putting their own life at risk of getting in a balloon and going across the Atlantic and things like that to publicize the passion and their belief in flight. And so those are sorts of people that live the brand. But I think increasingly, as we go forward, we're going to see brands themselves modernize by the very representation of the people that they choose. And we're seeing this time and time again. I think perhaps that Uber is a good example of choosing a leader which perhaps is more representative of the values that the organization has going into the future rather than those of the past.
Great. Another question here. What are a few tips you can give companies that would like to include thought leadership as part of their marketing strategy?
Well, they have to recognize what they're asking for when they talk about thought leadership, because it means being original. It means going to the parenthesis of the discussion. And that may mean that their view becomes controversial. And so consequently, the first characteristic that requires is courage. They have to have the courage of their convictions if they see something which needs to be raised. As thought leadership goes hand in hand in courage, you can't be a timid thought leader.
I have another question here. How do companies measure success of thought leadership programs?
Well, this goes to the problem that we were talking about between the ephemeral and the enduring, that the ephemeral is very easy to measure because often it's quantitative. The enduring is much more tricky because it tends to be qualitative. And so it has to be a mixture of the two. But in boardrooms, when they're thinking about how you measure those sorts of things, it comes down also to a simple thing called moral compass. Are you doing the right thing? And these days, if the boardroom doesn't do the right thing, then people outside can easily spot that. And there are now no longer any places where wrongdoing can be hidden. We live in an environment where the multiplicity of channels is bringing greater sunshine and fresh air to every boardroom. Nobody can escape that, no matter how secretive they are.
All right, we've got another question here. Where or how does one begin to build brand leadership? So what's really that first step in becoming a brand leader?
You do that every day. And you do that every day with the attitude that you bring, because a brand is also an attitude. And so if you're a leader and you want to build a brand, well, like Gandhi says, you've got to be part of the change you want to see. And so work out what the brand values you are that you want to represent, have your to-be list, and start demonstrating the brand. And you can ask people whether you've demonstrated it, but in any good relationship, whether it's a business or otherwise, it wouldn't be much of a relationship if you sat down every 90 days and said to your partner, can you tell me how I've done on the following KPIs? I think a good business relationship should be like a good human relationship, where people actually know that they're in the right place and that they're having fun and that they're valued. You shouldn't need to reduce that to a set of quantitative KPIs.
We have a couple more questions. How do you scale the cultural benefits of leadership beyond executive teams and boardrooms?
Well, how do you scale values? If openness and a sense of fun is value, do you need to scale it? Because this is the point about granting permission. You can't do this top down. It has to be bottom up. The leadership exists as a way of granting permission by being in a certain way. So when people look at leaders, and often this is a visual approach, they don't just look at what the leader says, they look at what they do and what they are. And so by doing that, you allow it to scale if you make it okay to trust people. I think there was a quote from F.D. Roosevelt, who said that the best way of proving that somebody is a trustworthy person is by trusting them.
Great. Okay, final question here. I think this is a good one. In the current social media-centric climate, can leaders trying to build a brand keep their personal and professional existence separate?
Well, I think that if they have a set of values that they live by personally, and their organization is living by a different set of values, then people will spot that deficit. They'll spot the incongruity. And my advice to leaders whose organizations don't share their personal values is probably not to work in them.
Great. It looks like that's it on the questions, and it looks like we're kind of wrapping up here on time. I did like to mention that we have a few more webinars in this series coming up, and to register for future sessions or to access previous webinars, visit our events page on our website at teamlewis.com. We've also included Miles's contact info here. Feel free to drop him a line with any questions on today's conversation, or if you'd like some more information about XPro. So yeah, thank you all very much for joining today's session. As mentioned at the start of the webinar, we will send everyone an email with a link to the recording of today's presentation. Thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Shazia. Thank you, Annalisa. And thank you, Miles. Again, this has been great fun.
Yes, great. All right. Bye, everybody.